Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this seminar for the 2020 part as part of the 2021 National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast. And my name is Mervyn Thomas, and I'm the founder and CEO of, not CEO, founder and president of CSW. And we are going to be having two expert guests today to talk about the situation of genocide. Genocide is the gravest of international crimes. The UK and other signatories to the 1948 UN Genocide Convention have an obligation to prevent and to punish this and other atrocity crimes. Yet, despite the widely articulated slogan, "Never again," there is a seeming reluctance to address early warning of atrocity crimes, with efforts to do so becoming more and more mired in arguments about genocide determination. Recently, an amendment to the government's trade bill drafted by the House of Lords, which would have facilitated a judicial ruling on genocide, was narrowly defeated in the House of Commons. Meanwhile, indications of impending genocide and other atrocity crimes continue to emerge across the world, including the plight of the Uyghurs in China, reported violations in Tigray, in Ethiopia, and the deteriorating situations in Burma, Nigeria, and elsewhere. The purpose of this seminar today is to discuss how should we be responding to such situations, and how can the international community work to prevent genocide from being committed. I'm thrilled that our first speaker today is in fact the author of that amendment to the Genocide Amendment to the Trade Bill, very often called the Alton Amendment. Lord Alton joins us today, and Lord Alton has been campaigning on human rights and religious freedom issues for many years now. Was a member of Parliament for 18 years before he went into the House of Lords in 1997, and now sits as a crossbench peer. So welcome, Lord Alton. We're looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you very much, Mervyn. It's a great pleasure to be with you and also with my good friend Knox, Thames, and I look forward to hearing what he will have to say after I've spoken. But let me start by saying to you, Mervyn, that over these last more than 40 years now in both Houses of Parliament, for me it's been a privilege to work with CSW and with you especially. These invitations from you are not just looked at when they arrive. I regard them rather like people regard a three-line whip. But I love CSW because over these years, whenever I've asked for information, when I've asked you to authenticate things that have been said to me, I know I can go to you and I know that the information will be accurate. And as I'll say at the end of my remarks today, one of the last visits I made overseas just before lockdown was with a member of CSW staff, and we went to northern Iraq together and met some of the people who had suffered in the genocide there. So that's a good way maybe for me to begin my remarks today. But Dag Hammarskjöld, who was a truly inspirational Secretary General of the United Nations, and incidentally a deeply committed Christian, once said that the United Nations, these are his words, was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. But we meet today, and as Mervyn has already said, from Xinjiang to Burma, from Tigray to Nigeria, from Iraq to Sudan, and indeed many other parts of the world, the international community has fallen a long way short in saving millions of people from the hell of genocide and from atrocity crimes generally. While the victims suffer appalling violations, the perpetrators struck the world stage, confident of their impunity and the triumph of mercantile and other interests over our convention duties under that 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, to look for the signs of genocide, to protect, to prevent, and finally to prosecute those who are responsible for these heinous crimes. In the post-war years, men such as Raphael Lemkin, who was a Jewish Polish lawyer, and women such as Eleanor Roosevelt bequeathed the institutions that emerged from the ashes of Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz and the other camps. And one of those legacies is the International Court of Justice, and later the International Criminal Court, And it's to those bodies that the United Kingdom government defers, stating in repeated parliamentary replies to me that, their words, the UK is fully committed to honouring its legal obligations under the Genocide Convention. The government's long-standing policy is that, please note, any judgment on whether genocide has occurred is a matter for competent courts. These include international courts such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and national criminal courts that meet international standards of due process. Close quotes. That's the government's position. But as became clear during the proceedings on the Genocide Amendment to the Trade Bill that Mervyn has mentioned, that is simply a convenient sleight of hand, disguising the shameful inability, or I would argue unwillingness, to bring perpetrators of genocide to justice. The government cannot plausibly offer that response, simultaneously telling us that Russia and China will inevitably use their Security Council veto to close routes to the international courts, while the government themselves close routes to domestic courts. The all-party Genocide Amendment to the Trade Bill offered a way out of the cul-de-sac and a route to our own national courts, and it was given three-figure majorities in the House of Lords, supported on all sides of the House, but it was opposed by the government. My colleague, Lord Hope of Craighead, a crossbench peer, that is also a former Supreme Court judge, and other distinguished members of the House, told the Lords that the current arrangements simply do not work, and that our own High Court of England and Wales was perfectly capable of adjudicating on whether a genocide is underway. But despite the government saying that they believe that there should be a route to the national courts, they closed that route off. When the proposal came within a whisker of defeating the government in the Commons, they offered a compromise of a committee to examine allegations of genocide. So some small progress was made. But despite raising that proposition with the relevant authorities, such a committee has yet to be established to examine whether the Uyghurs, for example, are subject to a genocide in Xinjiang. This is simply the long grass of delay and procrastination. And even if such a committee is established, the government refused to say that they will accept such a determination and continue to say, well, it's a matter for the courts, knowing that it's simply a piece of stage magic illusion to offer that argument. And never mind their determination to disregard a parliamentary committee, we should also note that as recently as on April the 22nd, the House of Commons, not a committee, the House of Commons voted to declare the crimes against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang to be a genocide, and the government have not accepted that either. Unsurprising, since they have never accepted that even the murder of over 1 million Armenians during the First World War in 1915 was a genocide, although it's to its credit. Such recognition was one of the first acts of the incoming Biden administration in the United States. The United States, Canada, and European countries such as the Netherlands, Lithuania, and others have all declared that a genocide is underway against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but not the United Kingdom government. I recently asked Dominic Raab, our Foreign Secretary, to lead international efforts to ensure that at least the Security Council take action against genocide by challenging the use of veto. We need to do that if we're going to prevent credible resolutions from being laid and ignored before the Security Council. And it's a call I repeat today. But let's be realistic and recognize that China and Russia will even resist such a change in the use of the veto. But nevertheless, it's worth the United Kingdom raising its standard and showing who it is who is trying to block a route to justice. So for now, at least the least we can do is enable the United Kingdom's High Court to evaluate the evidence and make the determination. There's no point identifying the problem without willing the solution. And this has become a circular argument, and it was to break that vicious circle that I tabled the Genocide Amendment. Incidentally, the Foreign Secretary has told me that legislative attempts in both houses had, and these are his words, shifted the dial. And perhaps with the Biden administration, we can push the dial further. At the United Nations Human Rights Council, which ironically China is now a member of, Dominic Raab rightly said that what is happening in Xinjiang, these are his words, is on an industrial scale. He's also said this was something he never believed we would ever see again happen in our lifetimes. Yet simultaneously, the United Kingdom Trade Minister, Lord Grimstone, tells us in Parliament that it's his ambition to deepen trading links with China, a state credibly accused of genocide. And I just throw the question to you, each of you, is it ever licit to seek to deepen trade with a country credibly accused of genocide, or for that matter, one which uses slave labor? I pointed out in Parliament that the great high priest, if you can call him that, of free trade, the wonderful Richard Cobden, said he was opposed to the slave trade, even though he was in favor of free trade. He was opposed to the Opium Wars, even though he was in favor of free trade, as I am, because there are some lines that you need to draw. That line, I would say, is the 1948 Genocide Convention. And it requires us, not anybody else, unless they're signatories, it requires us as a state to look for the signs of genocide, then to prevent, then to protect, and then to punish. In traveling to northern Iraq in 2019 with CSW, I met Yazidi and Christian survivors of the ISIS genocide. We failed them in preventing and protecting, and now we've largely failed to hold to account those who were responsible. And now we're also failing the people of Tigray. I was telling Mervyn that earlier today I put up a post and a tweet about a report in today's Daily Telegraph about the bombing of a village in Tigray. 69 people at least were killed and 200 injured, including women and children. There are also reports coming out of Tigray of mass graves, of rape being used as a weapon of war. Al Jazeera had an extraordinary report about how militias had literally been raping women and destroying their wombs so that they would never be able to bring children, Tigrayan children, into the world again. There have been summary executions and the targeting of religious figures. There was a report that more than 60 priests, mainly from Orthodox traditions, had been murdered. These are all detailed in a briefing provided by CSW to parliamentarians. The UN humanitarian chief said only last week that starvation, his word, starvation is being used as a weapon of war, and that 350,000 people are now in a state of famine. This isn't about drought or locusts or natural phenomena that have created this catastrophe, but the actions of people with power. The governments of Abiy Ahmed and Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki unleashed these horrors and have failed to end it, or even to ensure access to humanitarian agencies. Reports suggest that their forces have been burning fields and stores and slaughtering livestock. And they're also accused of having systematically blocked aid deliveries to parts of Tigray. It's not Nobel Peace Prizes, which Abiy and Afwerki have received, but indictments. It also tells us all that we need to know, that China and Russia blocked attempts to discuss allegations about what is underway in Tigray at the United Nations Security Council, while the 2016 recommendations of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea, which is now embroiled in Tigray, have never been implemented, just like the Commission of Inquiry report in 2015 into North Korea. And after all, Mr. Justice Kirby, who undertook that report, said North Korea is a state without parallel, and said that the things that were happening there, he compared them with the Holocaust. It's not insignificant that Eritrea is often called the North Korea of Africa. What are we doing to prevent, protect, or to collect the evidence in Tigray? What are we doing to bring Burma's illegal junta to justice? And in the light of the atrocities against Rohingya and Kachin, what are we going to do to take forward the Gambia's admirable decision to pursue the Burmese military at the ICJ? Yes, the dial may be shifting, but it's not fast enough for beleaguered and suffering people in Burma, Tigray, northern Nigeria, and Xinjiang and elsewhere. Dag Hammarskjöld's ambition to create effective mechanisms to save humanity from hell remains unfulfilled. But we mustn't throw in the towel. We have clear duties to hold to account those responsible for atrocity, crimes, and genocide. And in meeting those obligations, we must redouble our efforts. Thank you for inviting me today, Mervyn, to speak about this.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for those, as always, very pertinent insights and questions, many questions that you've posed there, and we will get round to discussing some of those a little bit later, but thank you so much. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce another good friend of mine, Knox Thames from the US. Thank you for getting up early for us, Knox, to join us on this this seminar. Knox has been in the religious freedom space, if you like, for many years now. Has worked at on the Helsinki Commission. When I first met him, he was working with USERF, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and then, of course, more recently, he served across 2 administrations as a special advisor for religious minorities at the US State Department. But currently is a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement and the US Institute of Peace. So welcome, Knox, and we look forward to hearing your contribution this morning. Thank you.
Visiting the Holocaust Museum is always a challenging experience, emotionally and intellectually. It's situated just off Independence Avenue in Washington, D.C., within sight of the Washington Monument, and it serves as a stark reminder of the failure of the international community to protect Jews from the horrors of genocide and the millions of people who were murdered because of their religious identity or beliefs. And it really stands to ensure the phrase "never again" holds true. Yet encountering the museum with a Rohingya Muslim activist brings the reality of 21st century persecution into stark relief. I experienced this back in 2019 when touring with Wei Wei Nu, a brave young woman we had brought to the State Department to share about her imprisonment in Myanmar's notorious Insin prison. She told me that the museum's pictures reminded her of Myanmar today for the Rohingya people. I'd helped organize this visit for her and a group of survivors of 21st century religious persecution before the US the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. And we brought survivors from contemporary situations of persecution from Burma and China, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Pakistan, Sudan, Turkey, Vietnam, and Yemen, representing multiple faith communities, Christians of every denomination, Jews, Muslims, Yazidis, Baha'is, Ahmadis, Buddhists, and members of the secular humanist community. We invited them to the Ministerial to ground our discussions with the actual impact of the persecuted, so they could serve as a tangible, physical reminder of the challenges that real people face daily. And so walking through those hallways, seeing those pictures, feeling the weight of the horror, and doing so with the survivors of contemporary religious persecution brought the experience to an entirely different level. So as much as we want to view museums like this as a history lesson, something disconnected from our present reality, we cannot. Persecution based on religion or belief continues, and it continues today. Religious persecution is as old as human history, but it's not history. For many faith communities around the world, never again is happening again. So I want to thank CSW and Mervyn for convening this important discussion. And of course, it's a great honor to be on any panel with Lord Alton. I think we'd all agree that no one should live in fear of persecution for peacefully practicing their belief or non-beliefs. But atrocities continue as governments and authoritarian regimes want to set the rules on the road, on the highway to heaven, with stiff penalties for unapproved lane changes. And not only do governments persecute, but extremists and terrorists will stop at nothing to victimize religious minorities. We all know the studies from the Pew Research Center that show the moment that we're in. On one hand, 84% of the global community believes in God or higher power, while roughly 2/3 of humanity live in countries with significant restrictions on the practice of faith. This is a recipe for human rights violations and unrest as people struggle to peacefully live out their deepest held convictions. So my driving belief is that everybody, everywhere has a fundamental right to follow their conscience wherever it leads. We know that human flourishing will more quickly come when everyone, everywhere can believe or not to believe as they choose. We also know that policymakers will succeed if they take this into consideration, and they will likely fail if they do not acknowledge the importance of religion to billions of people. So as I experienced that morning at the Holocaust Museum, we have failed to learn the painful lessons of the ultimate crime against humanity. We see that these ancient hatreds still live. We know that repression continues, but today something can be done about the persecution and the genocides we see occurring around the world. But a holistic, forthright response is needed, one that fights for freedom of conscience for everyone, so that 21st century persecution doesn't bleed into the 22nd century. So it's incumbent upon the United Kingdom and the United States, our elected officials, our diplomats, as well as our activists and religious leaders to lead. I mean, it was great to see human rights front and center in the joint US-UK statement between President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson. It was ambitious in scope, reflected of the shared values between our countries, addressing the need to protect open societies, women's rights, media freedoms, and freedom of religion or belief. However, to be more than just rhetoric, successful implementation must be backed up by consequential diplomacy. I mean, the easy days of naming and shaming are over. When confronting a country like China and others, they'll push back. Just ask Lord Alton. The question is, how much do we value our values? Are we willing to lose trade deals to avoid dealing with genocideers? It's an easier question for a large country, harder for small, as morality is often a luxury of the rich. And this is why we need the United Kingdom and the United States to confront genocides wherever and whenever they occur. So how should we be responding to these situations? How can the international community work to prevent genocides from occurring? Well, there's different scenarios that are going to require different tools. Look at Iraq and Syria, where ISIS went on a rampage. We've seen the Christian community that was once one of the largest in the Middle East shrink from about 1.5 million to 250,000, maybe. The cradle of Christianity now may be a graveyard. And we saw what ISIS did to the Yazidi people. As Mervyn mentioned, I worked during both the Obama and Trump administrations to have US concerns expressed with the most forceful language possible, calling what ISIS did a genocide. And I was proud that both Secretary Kerry and Secretary Tillerson from Obama and Trump administrations made the right decision to use that term. Elsewhere, we know that Myanmar's army has committed war crimes against Rohingya Muslims that equal genocide. China has demonstrated genocidal intent against the Uyghur Muslims, aiming at nothing less than destroying Islam in the province of Xinjiang, where 10 million Muslims live. After I left government, I was very glad to see Secretary Pompeo refer to this as a genocide and Secretary Blinken agreeing. It was a rare area of foreign policy agreement between the Trump and Biden administrations. And I hope the Biden administration will make the same determination regarding Myanmar. But despite the 20th century lessons of the Holocaust, mass atrocities continue in the 21st. And our countries play an indispensable role in providing assistance to refugees and IDPs fleeing persecution at the hands of groups like ISIS, as well as governments. And yet the violence perpetrated by Myanmar and China goes well past anything ISIS could ever hope to achieve in Iraq and Syria. It is suffering on an industrial scale. Now we know, despite these atrocities, China actively pushes a false narrative of fighting terrorism while bullying countries into silence. Consequently, many Muslim majority countries have lost their voice out of fear of China's might, leaving the US, UK, and the West to speak out. But this is where the United States, the United Kingdom, due to our strength and global reach, we're uniquely positioned to push back. So consistent and bold leadership from Washington and London is needed to meet this challenge. And I think thanks to US and UK leadership and activity, for the first time in human history, positive forces are marshaling across political, religious, and geographic lines to push back against persecution. Our countries have worked together to create new networks of governments, parliamentarians, and civil society that provide unique, unprecedented opportunities for coordination. And I also want to give a tip of the hat to the United Kingdom that during the G7 meeting, including a reference to FORB in the final communique for the first time ever. But to really move the needle, we have to do more than just name and shame. We have to move to consequential diplomacy that impacts foreign relationships in concrete ways. Now we know that bringing our values into sensitive relationships will cause trouble. While it may be politically easy to place a spotlight on a country like Iran, we can't ignore what's happening in China or Burma, or India's treatment of Muslims and Christians, or the jailing of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia and the lack of any churches, the growth of anti-Semitism worldwide. It would be easier to not care about human rights. Russia, China, they don't burden themselves with these concerns, but that's not who we are. Our idealism runs deep, and it goes beyond just our values. Pressing for a freer and more just world is actually in our self-interest. As the late Senator John McCain wrote in his final book, it is the opposite of naivete to fight for human rights. In fact, it's an exercise in realism to understand the cost for winking at abuses. Countries that fail to respect the people's rights will break trade deals, ignore commitments, operate opaquely and unfairly. As demonstrated by China, our hoped for reforms never materialize for our all carrots and no stick economic engagement over decades. Beijing pocketed our stated concerns, made a lot of money, and pushed ahead because we failed to enforce consequences. So consequential diplomacy creates consequences. So the first step is highlighting abuses. There's still an important role for naming and shaming, and doing so in multilateral institutions like the UN. Let's fight the Russians. Let's fight the Chinese if they want to veto it. Let's pound the table with the truth. And our relations should look different between atrocity committing governments and democratic rights respecting nations. Additionally, coupling multilateralism with tools like the Magnitsky Act can create consequences for the perpetrators for the first time. They can feel the pinch when provincial authorities or federal ministers are targeted. I saw how these provisions can create leverage with the way we saw Sudan move towards a greater openness for religious freedom because of the religious freedom blacklist they were placed on. And lastly, a human rights vision must also hold accountable companies who profit from atrocity crimes in places like Myanmar and China. Just yesterday, there was a Washington Post story about Uyghur forced labor being used to make solar panels. So it's going to be difficult to sort out supply chains, but it's something we have to do because we should not sacrifice our morals for economic advancement. Now, carrying our values forward will force hard choices. Steadfastly advocating for fundamental freedoms with friend and foe, however, can be a reliable pole star in these uncertain times. If human rights truly matter, then they must matter in every relationship. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, to ignore evil is to become an accomplice to it. So we need everyone to get engaged, to speak out, to help build a brighter future. While we may expect persecution and genocides to continue, we don't have to accept it. And without new efforts and new advocates, millions will suffer. So what we do in response to these ultimate form of persecution, genocide, matters. It matters for the individuals who are locked away in some godforsaken prison that they know others are working for their freedom. It matters that the abusers know men and women of goodwill are standing up and speaking out against their persecution. It matters that we honor the sacrifice of those who were murdered in previous or ongoing genocides, who paid the ultimate price, that we make sure never again is a reality. As Martin Luther King also said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So it matters what we do. It matters that we do this work holistically and unafraid, standing up for the persecuted, speaking out on those suffering genocide, tirelessly advocating for freedom of conscience for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Knox, for that powerful speech. And, you know, before I ask Lord Alton if he has any response to that, I would just reiterate to those who are attending this seminar, if you have any questions, please do to put to the panelists. We've already got quite a number come in, but if you've got any, please do put them in the Q&A so that we can ask the panelists that question. Lord Alton, you know, Knox there mentioned about you know, about the G7 summit and the statement after that, which it was good to see human rights and religious freedom to the fore there. Have you got any comments on that?
Yes, I agree, of course, with Knox, and endorse everything, in fact, that he's said to us. I think that there has been a wake-up call during this COVID period. It's forced us to look at one another again in ways we maybe hadn't done previously. I think also we've been looking at China and the Chinese Communist Party. And I make a big distinction between those two things. As someone, I think Knox was referring to it in something he said. I mean, I've been sanctioned, as have people like my friend, former Senator Sam Brownback and Congressman Chris Smith, and people who I've made common cause with over the years on these issues. I've been sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. But why is that? It's because of speaking out. It's, as Knox said, about banging the table for human rights and speaking out and not being silenced. And that is the way we can change things, because although we look back and say never again, and we talk about, as we must do, the events of the Holocaust, let's also remember 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mervyn, you and I used to go into the former Soviet Union. I wondered if we'd ever see the fall of the wall in our lifetimes. I wondered if we'd see the end of apartheid in South Africa. But we have seen extraordinary change, but it doesn't happen as a result of sitting back and just wringing your hands and complaining. In fact, Martin Luther King, who's been referred to by Knox in his remarks, said that we have to become broken backed. We have to bear the weight on our own backs of the suffering of others if we want to bring about change. It doesn't happen by itself. So I think we have to be steadfast. I liked what Knox said as well about how the great nations have got to accept that this may bring some pain with it. And it will. The story yesterday that he referred to about the manufacturing of solar panels. Well, you can be, I put a website post about this myself yesterday. You can be in favor of renewable energy and solar power, wind power, and all these things, as I am, without saying I'm in favor of slave labor in Xinjiang producing it. And isn't there a question here for a country like our own about our own national resilience? I had a question in the House of Lords about this in a couple of weeks' time, about why we have become so dependent on a country like China. We did it in telecommunications disastrously and only at the last minute, and thanks to the pressure on us by the United States, Australia, and others, did we decide that, oh, it wasn't such a good idea to let the Chinese Communist Party have control of our telecommunications infrastructure. I mean, think about the security implications of this. So almost at the last gasp, we said we would freeze them out of the G5 telecommunications infrastructure, but we've already got them in many other elements of that structure and many other things too. I put down a question recently about something as simple as the bilateral flow tests that people are using to see if they have COVID. And I knew that Chinese companies had been selling these to the United Kingdom. So I asked a question in Parliament: how many of these have we bought? How much money has it cost British taxpayers? What companies have been involved in these things? And what reply did I get? First of all, we can't tell you which companies, it's commercially sensitive. We can't tell you what it's cost, it's commercially sensitive. This is public money we're talking about. But I did get an answer for how many had we bought. And it wasn't 100,000, it wasn't 1 million, it was 1 billion. These are the official government figures. Lateral flow tests that we've bought from China. Are you telling me we couldn't have manufactured these things in the United Kingdom? And so I think there are questions here about national resilience, and there are questions about standing together. The World Trade Organization has done nothing about the way in which China has used subsidies to support things like the production of solar energy panels, or for that matter, to be able to bid to buy out our own companies who can't bid at the same level because they don't receive the same subsidies. It's against WTO rules, and nothing has been done about that. We have to reform the WTO. Look what China has done against WTO rules to Australia for daring to ask for an independent inquiry into the origins of the Wuhan virus. And you think about that young Christian woman that CSW has been campaigning for, as I have been too, Zhang Zheng, a young woman, a lawyer, who became a citizen journalist, went to Wuhan to try and find out more about the truth of where the virus first came from. And she is now languishing in a prison, having been on a hunger strike. I think it's a 4-year prison sentence. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, Mervyn. Australia, as a result of calling out China, asking for an inquiry, immediately had a boycott on the sale of all its wines into China. And subsidies have been stacked against Australia by the Chinese. we don't stand together on these things, and sometimes we even exploit the opportunities that we think that presents. And let me end on this question by telling you about the story of a Christian woman who contacted me recently, not from China, not from Australia, not from the United States, from not that far from where I am at the moment, here in Lancashire. She lives in Wigan. She was a librarian in Wigan for 34 years. She put up on social media that she was troubled by Wigan Council deciding to bring in Chinese companies to undertake the redevelopment of the town. This woman was literally marched out of the library and suspended. She remained suspended. 34 years she'd been in that post. And she told me in an email, and she's made this public, that she felt compelled to talk about this as a matter of conscience because she worried that there were links between the companies involved and some of the human rights violations that she had read about and heard about. And it isn't just local authorities, it's universities as well. I'm connected with a number of universities, and I see how much money flows into them now from the Chinese Communist Party. You see the transfer of intellectual property to China, which threatens our security and defense and undermines academic freedom as well. So there's a whole stack of issues here that we have got to get real about. And I think that at last at the G7 summit, because of all these events and because of what has happened through COVID-19, I think that people have woken up. We're no longer sleepwalking as we were before, but we now need to form stronger alliances between democratic nations and demonstrate, as Knox has said, in institutions internationally, the difference between an autocratic state and a democratic state. China Weekly, which is a newspaper circulated by the Chinese Communist Party, has on its headline this week the words, "China, the biggest, greatest democracy in the world." Well, this must be one of the most self-delusional things that anyone's ever written, but it tells you all you need to know about the kind of propaganda that they are trying to sell. Tell that to the people of Hong Kong. Tell it to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Tell it to the Falun Gong practitioners or the Buddhists or the Protestants who have seen their churches destroyed, or the Catholics who've got underground bishops and seminarians as recently as last month arrested and imprisoned in China. Knox talked about Martin Luther King. Let me mention Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, and of course he was executed by the Nazis for being part of the small confessing church that stood against Hitler and the Nazis. He said, but not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. We haven't got that luxury. What we do have, though, is the privilege of living in a parliamentary democracy like this. And we must use our voices, we must use our votes. And whether we end up being sanctioned by the CCP is neither here nor there.
Yeah, thank you, David. I just on the back of that, Knox, you know, the response needs to be more than the US and the UK, as David has quite rightly said. It needs to be. So many countries around the world are fearful of China, mainly because of trade. And David, in his first contribution, posed the question: is it ever right to trade with a country that we suspect is committing genocide? What's your answer to that, Knox?
No, I mean, no. I wouldn't want the United States to ever be benefiting from the enslavement and persecution of people. I mean, it's always dangerous to make analogies to the Holocaust, but what you're seeing in China is just, you can't ignore them. A people group based on their ethnicity and identity are being rounded up into concentration camps, re-education camps, forced to do work against their will, families broken up. I mean, it's unimaginable that this is happening in the 21st century. And I think it's coming upon all of us, especially stronger, richer nations like our own, to lead, to try to build a counter push to tell the Chinese, we're not against the Chinese people, we're against genocide. And if you want to join the international community and be a responsible player, then be a responsible player. And you've got what's going on in Tibet and against the underground church and Falun Gong in Hong Kong. So they've got a lot of problems, but it's going to take leadership, and it will be costly. It won't be cost less. but it'll be the right thing to do. And if we ignore it, it'll only embolden them. And we know that they'll just continue to grab up market share and other issues if we don't at some point say stop.
Yeah. Let me, before we leave this, Mervyn, because I endorse exactly what Knox has just said, but for some of those who are in the breakfast today and who are here now, they ought to try and get hold of, if they haven't read it, Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. Corrie ten Boom and her sister were sent to Ravensbrück prison camp, concentration camp, by the Nazis because they had been helping Jewish people to escape, and they were caught themselves. Her sister died in that camp. Corrie survived, and she tells the story about how companies like Siemens, they were working for Siemens inside those camps, producing electrical parts and components as slave labor. That is no different from what we see in Xinjiang today. And that is why our own Foreign Secretary has said this is on an industrial scale,
Yeah.
And we need to do more as consumers to say no to this. It's not good enough for people to go out and buy cotton goods that we know have been processed from Xinjiang. It's not good enough to buy solar panels or whatever it may be. And often it's because we don't know in advance. With a lot of online shopping, people don't even know when they buy things that they're going to be coming from China. They just go, as we all do, for cheaper, better value, what seem like better value options. So we should have, I think there should be a kite sign on Amazon and elsewhere when things have been manufactured in China, so that we know that, and then we can start making choices. And we can make choices about things like the Genocide Olympics that are coming up. Now, I know it's difficult to stop the Olympic Games, and I'm not suggesting that, and individual sportsmen and women would suffer as a consequence, but there are some things we can do. We have no business sending politicians to glad hand it and to make Beijing think that this is okay. The royal family certainly should not send any representatives to Beijing, and we should make it clear that this is because of what they are doing to Uyghur people. How many Uyghurs are going to be taking part in the Beijing Olympics?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Let's we, and the point there, which I will make at the end, is that we do and we can all play a part in this. We need to all play. We can't leave it to Lord Alton. We can't leave it to Knox Thames and CSW. We all need to play a part in this. We all need to raise our voices. But we need to move on quickly to one or two questions that have been coming in. Both panelists here, do you feel that the religious aspects of the situation in Xinjiang, and of course, when let's go beyond Xinjiang, but China, it's not just the Uyghurs, of course, is it? Because Christians and Falun Gong and other minorities are persecuted there. But do you feel the religious aspects of the situation in China, Burma and Tigray are being overlooked by the international community? Knox?
I think it's situation by situation. I think in China, people recognize the religious aspect of the persecution for the Uyghurs and for the Tibetans. I think in Burma, I know when I was at the State Department, there would be parts of the Asia Bureau that would say religion's not a factor. It's not about their Islamic identity. And I would say, well, are you listening to the generals? Because they are saying it's about their Islamic identity. So this is where, religion is maybe not everything in a situation, but it's usually something. It's rarely nothing. And so the sooner that policymakers can come to grips with the reality that there can be a religious motivation or an animus against faith that is part of the motivation, the smarter our interventions and countermeasures will be. I think you're
Sorry,
muted,
David.
yeah.
I was muted.
Thanks, Mervyn. I think when this pandemic is over, all of us will remember the words, "Am I still muted?" But as you said before we started, there are quite a lot of people who have been quite happy to have muted me a long time ago.
Indeed, not me. I'm not one of them.
I'm glad to hear that. Article 18 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now note the year, note the date, the same year as the promulgation of the Convention on the Crime of Genocide. This isn't by accident. Article 18 says that everyone has the right to believe, not to believe, or to change their belief. And we know it's breached everywhere in the world. The Bishop of Truro's report to the Foreign Secretary nearly 3 years ago said that 250 million Christians are persecuted worldwide. And in every country where there is persecution, Christians are persecuted. But that isn't to say that others aren't persecuted too. And the Bishop of Truro made that point. So you take the example of Ahmadis in Pakistan. Ahmadi people are not allowed to call themselves Muslim. They are prohibited from having any of the same civil liberties and civil rights as the majority community. And like the Christian minority and Hindu minority in Pakistan, they suffer grievously. Just one example, Knox referred to others. There is for me a sort of trajectory that begins when you ignore discrimination. Only this week I wrote a letter complaining about advertisements which had appeared in the newspapers in Pakistan saying that only non-Muslims should apply for a particular job. What was that job? What would they be employed doing? It's cleaning latrines. Only non-Muslims should apply. This is blatant discrimination. Or you think this week of the 13-year-old girl who has been forcibly abducted, forcibly married off, forcibly converted in Pakistan, and there are other examples that I've been giving recently as well. This is then moving on from discrimination to becoming a crime, and those can easily, I think, morph into outright persecution and crimes against humanity. And then finally, I think you reach genocide. But it starts with it turning a blind eye to discrimination. So it's about Article 18. And this is not a religious document. This is a secular document promulgated by the founding fathers and mothers of the United Nations. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the key people in its composition. So we've got to do more. And I think we've got to breathe new life into many of these documents, but also into the mechanisms that enforce the grand statements. There's a lot of good rhetoric, but it has to be matched by reality and actions.
Thank you. We are coming to the end, unfortunately, of our time. But I'd like to ask you one more question, which we haven't got to many of the questions that have come up, but I'd like to ask you both a question. You are both Christians, like I am, and like many people who will be listening to this seminar because we've been at the prayer breakfast this morning. How important is it that as Christians we speak up for all those persecuted for their faith, particularly for those that don't share our Christian faith? Knox, what do you say to that? How important is this?
I think it's the essence of living out Christ's call to go and do likewise. I've often talked about the example of the Good Samaritan. We all know the story. Robbers beset upon a traveler. People from his own community refused to help, and it was a Samaritan in the story who was the hero. And this was a huge twist for the day because Jews and Samaritans hated each other. They were viewed as a different ethnic group, a different religion. And yet Christ said the hero in the story was someone who went across those religious and ethnic lines to help someone who was in need. And then the command for us is to go and do likewise. Of course, we help our own. Of course, we need to be doing more to speak up for the persecuted church. But in living out that call to go and do likewise, we cannot ignore, and we must also be assisting our fellow brothers and sisters who are suffering for what they believe because they're made in God's image just like we are. So I think it's part and parcel with living out your Christian faith is being an advocate for everyone.
Thanks, Knox. David.
Well, yeah, I come from what I often describe as the failed again tradition of Christianity. And sometimes my faith, it slides and comes more powerfully. But I'll tell you what, you only have to visit Christians who are suffering for their faith. And this is the other end of the two-way street that Knox has just described. That can be for you a powerful boost to your own faith. If a faith isn't even worth living for, and you go and meet people who for them their faith is worth dying for, that certainly challenges you in ways that maybe you hadn't previously imagined. On one of my first visits into the former Soviet Union, I was arrested with a friend as we were going into Ukraine and kept overnight. It was a minor inconvenience compared with the people that we met the following day, one of whom, a bishop, Pavlo Vasilik, the bishop of the Greek Catholic Church, had spent 17 years in prison. We met his friend Evangel, who had spent 18 years in the same prison in Prem in the former Soviet Union. We met the young chaplain who was accompanying the bishop. He couldn't be a proper bishop. He had to be a collector of herbs, and the young clergyman had to be a stoker of boilers. He'd been caught celebrating the liturgies and had been sent to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste as a punishment, simply for doing the things that we take for granted. So for me, this is the thing that fortifies faith. It's not just about doing what I can to help people. It's what it does for me in a most extraordinarily powerful way, and helps me not to take my faith for granted. We are required to look out for those who live in the same household of faith as all of us on this call.
Thank you.
And that should be our starting point.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, we've come right to the end of our time, but I'd like to thank you both, obviously, for your great contributions today. I'd like to thank everybody who has been listening. And I think it's very important that we do take away from this, that we're all in this together. We all are, if we don't speak up, if we don't stand up and speak up, we are complicit on what is going on in all of these countries and these places around the world. So I just want to tell you, if you're here as part of the seminar today, what you can do to respond to this today. I'd like to highlight one particular campaign. It's a petition on change.org to address conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The link is coming up in the chat right now, and this is in support of women of African descent who marked the International Day of for the elimination of sexual violence in conflict with an open letter in solidarity with the women and girls in the Tigray region of Ethiopia who are currently targets of systematic campaign that's increasingly described as genocidal rape. The petition is open to everyone, and the deadline is just the 5th of July. This is urgent. So please, could I urge everybody to follow that link, to go on and to make your voice heard. This is about us all standing together, standing up and speaking out. And secondly, if you're a church leader on here today and would like to find out more how we at CSW can resource your church to pray and to give and to campaign for religious freedom, to join and stand alongside giants like David Alton and Knox, Thames and others around the world, you can play your part in your church. If you go and visit the link that's coming up on the chat now from csw.org.uk/churches, you'll find resources that will enable you to be a powerful voice too. Let's all stand up and speak out together. Thank you, Lord Alton. Thank you for Knox Thames. Thank you all for joining us today. And God bless you all.